George Bernard Shaw wrote, "In the Middle Ages, people believed that the earth was flat, for which they had at least the evidence of their senses. We believe it to be round, not because as many as 1% of us could give the physical reasons for so quaint a belief, but because modern science has convinced us that nothing that is obvious is true, and that everything that is magical, improbable, extraordinary, gigantic, microscopic, heartless, or outrageous is scientific."
Know what you're supposed to believe when it comes to the heliocentric model? Is this what you believe? Because this is what they say is going on. The Earth tilted at 66.6 degrees from 90. The Earth spinning at 1,000 miles an hour. The Earth orbiting at 66,600 miles an hour. The Sun moving even faster through the galaxy as it races towards the so-called galactic center, and the galaxy itself moving even faster than that in its ever-expanding expansion. We don't feel it. We can't even get a negative test to prove any of this motion at all. And the famous Ares experiment showed, and Michelson-Morley and Sagnet and Gale, just to name a few. That was over 100 years ago. Yeah, they soundly defeated the theories of gravity and relativity and special relativity, but unfortunately the scientific community have been fooled by the leaders of academia as they buried the results, and their students and teachers alike, they never even knew these experiments took place. When scrutinized, all this movement just doesn't make sense. Remember that we always see the constellations in the same place, in the same order, the same height in the sky every single night. There is absolutely no stellar parallax whatsoever showing that we just don't move. So do you feel it? Can you feel any of that incredible speed and motion? You know, gas floats up, butterflies float around. When we view things from a zetetic observation point, we find out that we're not moving. The real scientific tests also show that we're not moving. The Bible tells us that we're not moving. Common sense tells us that we're not moving. Astrophysicists and space agencies have tried to con the world into believing their very satanic heliocentric lie. And they have done rather well up until now. But the cat's out of the bag, and this lie cannot continue forever.
if a telescope is pointing at a star and both are stationary, then obviously the light comes straight into the telescope. In 1729, Bradley found that he had to tip his telescope forward very slightly to get a star in the center of his telescope. It was assumed that this was due to the motion of the Earth around the Sun. Let us assume that the telescope was moving at 5 miles an hour and had to be tipped 5 degrees. This 5-degree tipping, however, could equally be caused by the ether moving at 5 miles an hour, carrying the stars around the Earth. As we see here, the light would be coming in at the same angle, and the telescope would still have to be tipped 5 degrees. So tipping the telescope does not tell us whether it is the starlight moving or the telescope moving. However, there is a simple experiment that can determine whether it was the Earth that was moving or the ether and starlight. All that you had to do was record the tipping required for any particular star, then fill the telescope with water, which greatly slows down the speed of light in the telescope. So here is the moving telescope filled with water, tipped at 5 degrees, and you can see that the starlight does not now reach the eyepiece at the bottom. This is because the starlight moves much more slowly when passing through water. However, if the telescope is tipped further, say 10 degrees, then the starlight will then be visible again in the eyepiece. It has to be tipped further because the light is now slower when in the telescope. But if the starlight is going past the telescope at 5 miles an hour, then when it is filled with water, no further tipping is needed because the light is coming in at 5 degrees anyway. The starlight stays on the same path but is only travelling slower in the water. To recap, if it is the telescope that is moving, then when it is filled with water, it has to be tipped further to see the star. If the telescope is stationary and the starlight drifting past us, then it does not have to be tipped further. In 1871, George Biddle Airy, the Astronomer Royal, performed this experiment. This is a copy from his original report. You can see that the two readings are virtually identical. The result of Airy's experiment, known as Airy's failure, was that the telescope does not have to be tipped further. This proved that it was the incoming light that was moving past a stationary telescope fixed to the stationary Earth.
Handful of experiments in physics that completely transformed physics. At many people's top of the list would have to be the Michelson-Morley experiment.
In the 19th century, physicists thought that since sound waves travel through air, light waves must travel through some sort of medium as well. They called this theoretical medium ether.
The famous luminiferous ether. this magical medium that was hypothesized to be what light required to move through the vacuum of space, just the way sound requires air to move from one place to another. How else could waves of light move through the vacuum of space unless there was some medium there, some hypothetical medium? Let's call it the ether.
Ether, they theorized, is an invisible nothingness that permeates the universe. Its only physical property is that it allows light to propagate through it. But once precise measurements of the speed of light became possible, testing the predicted effects of ether on the speed of light became possible as well. The Earth orbits the Sun at about 66,500 miles per hour. If light travels through ether, they reason, then as the Earth moves through the ether, the speed of light should be different going with the ether than perpendicular to it. In an attempt to show the effects of ether on the speed of light, Albert Michelson and Edward Morley conducted an experiment in 1887 at what is now Case Western Reserve University.
Michelson was an expert in optical experiments, and he thought that he could devise an experiment where one would be able to see the slight difference in the speed of light measured on the Earth if you measured it along the direction of the motion of the Earth and at right angles to it. There should be a slight difference.
Compared to the speed of light, Earth is not moving that fast. So if you're going to check the difference in the speed of light measured with the movement of the Earth compared with transverse to it, you need a level of precision that no one had before. The Michelson interferometer was just such an apparatus.
Michelson and Morley devised an apparatus that would detect minute differences in speed between two beams of light. Light from one source is split into two directions through a half-silvered mirror. These beams are bounced between other mirrors and then recombined back into a single beam. When two light beams combine, if their waves are completely synchronized, the peaks combine to make an even more intense peak. If they are one half wavelength off, their peaks combine and cancel out the intensity. Slight differences in speed between two light waves will therefore produce a pattern based on the amount of interference between the two beams. This is known as an interference pattern. Examining the interference pattern from the two light beams sent out in different directions would clearly show if the speed of each light beam were different in different directions. But Michelson and Morley never detected such a difference. Their results were inconsistent with the existence of ether.
The scientific world didn't know what to make of it. The famous scientists in Europe, all Lord Rayleigh and Lord Kelvin and Lord Thomson, were saying, hey, come on, you must have done something wrong here. There has to be an ether. And the whole thing didn't get resolved until many, many years later when Einstein came along.
Einstein's theory of special relativity proposed that the speed of light is always the same, regardless of the speed of the light source. The results of the Michelson-Morley experiment were entirely consistent with Einstein's view of the universe, and this served as the turning point in modern physics.
The Michelson-Morley experiment was an experimental advance in technology that transformed science. Not only physics, but science.
The experiment sought to prove if ether actually existed, and this was attempted by using what is called an interferometer, which is an arrangement of mirrors designed so that a beam of light could be divided and sent in two directions at the same time. What they were looking for was a change in the velocity between the two light beams due to the interference of the ether stream. The result of their experiment was that the velocity remained unchanged, regardless of the direction that the beams of light were sent. In other words, the result was negative. With this result, observing scientists told themselves that they had two choices: get rid of the ether entirely and all previous theories based upon it that dealt with electromagnetism, electricity, and light, or keep the ether and abandon the theory that the Earth is in motion. Essentially, if the ether existed to them, the experiment told them that the velocity of the Earth through the ether was exactly 0. Can one see the problem here? What would this do to public perception in regards to their home called Earth? If the Earth was moving exactly 0, meaning not at all, where exactly was it sitting? What exactly was our place in the universe? In 1905, at the age of 26, Albert Einstein published a paper that would in essence be the footprint for his special theory of relativity, which asserted that the laws of nature are the same for all uniformly moving systems. This again, for the scientific community, and thus the public, brought the Earth from its stationary position as related to the Sun, and without the use of ether, so to speak, set the world of physics on fire. What did this mean for all of us? A great deal if one is able to squelch through all of the tedious semantics and get to the true meaning of what this theory is actually stating. By accepting relativity as it stands, along with time dilation and all of its other relativistic properties, the world is accepting that there is no such thing as simultaneity, or what could be called the now. That's right, there is no such thing as now, which means that this science also gets rid of paradox and moves itself entirely into the realm of contradiction. To say that there is no now that is independent of a system of reference means that all conceptualization of a divine source goes straight into the trash bin.
To deny the ether is ultimately to assume that empty space has no physical qualities whatsoever. The fundamental facts of mechanics do not harmonize with this view. According to the general theory of relativity, space is endowed with physical qualities. In this sense, therefore, there exists an ether. According to the general theory of relativity, space without ether is unthinkable.
So, let's imagine a beam of light being reflected between two mirrors. Let's replicate this setup so we have another beam of light being reflected between another set of mirrors, but this time the mirrors are moving close to the speed of light. We can see in the moving set of mirrors that the beam of light is moving a greater distance. Now, let's put a couple of people into this scenario. Meet Alex. He sits inside the moving set of mirrors, and Bill sits inside the stationary set of mirrors. The speed of light must be the same for both Alex and Bill, and their light beams must hit the bottom mirror after the same amount of time has passed. But as Alex's light beam is covering a longer distance, how is that possible? Well, the only way for that to work is if time for Alex slows down. Look at the clock hand. Notice how Alex's clock hand is moving much more slowly compared to Bill's. Time for Alex has slowed, which allows his light beam to travel a greater distance. Look at it this way. Speed equals distance divided by time. As Alex's distance is more, the value of his time must be more. Or rather, Alex's 1 minute actually turns out to be longer than Bill's 1 minute when you compare the two. Time has slowed down for Alex. This is called time dilation. This is quite a hard concept to grasp because it seems to go against what we experience on a practical level. But to understand the theory of relativity, you must stop thinking of time as a fixed unit for everyone. Time is relative.
In 1913, Sagnac carried out a simple experiment of passing light in opposite directions around a table and recombining them. This produced interference fringes. He then rotated the whole table at 2 revolutions per second and found that the fringes changed. This result has very significant implications in science. It works as follows. A beam of light leaves the light source at the bottom left-hand corner and is split into 2 different beams, which we have coloured red and blue just to distinguish them. They travel round the circuit in opposite directions until they eventually reach the splitter, which also recombines them. There, they then go on to the photographic plate, where they have interference fringes. In this simplified version, we see that the beam is split into 2, the red and the blue again, and they go round the circuit and are recombined at the splitter and recombining prism, so that they again produce the fringes on the photographic plate. Now let us rotate the table. Before we do so, there is the very important subject of the effect of the ether. The Michelson-Morley experiment failed to detect the 30 kilometers per second motion of the Earth through the ether. So as to overcome this problem, Einstein simply abolished the ether in his relativity theory. The very significant result of the Sagnac experiment was that it proved that the ether existed. Let us see how it did this. It is a fundamental feature of relativity that it claims that as there is no ether, light travels away from a source at the same speed relative to the source, whether the source is moving or not. Thus, whether the table is turning or not, the fringe patterns should stay the same. But if the ether exists, once the light has left the source, the speed of the light is controlled by the ether independent of the speed of the table, mirrors, etc., as we see here. So let us see what happens when we rotate the table. Here, the light is split, and the red and blue lights go in opposite directions. But notice that the left-hand mirror has moved around in such a direction that the distance the red light has to travel is further. Now in relativity, the same time should be taken because the splitter is also moving and the distance between them is the same. But now imagine that the ether exists and the speed of the light is controlled by the stationary ether. Imagine the ether like a thick treacle that limits how fast the light can travel, independent of the motion of the light source, the splitter, or the mirrors. The result is that the red light takes longer to reach the left-hand mirror. Similarly, the right-hand mirror is coming towards the blue light, so it reaches the mirror quicker. After they change ends, the red light again takes longer to reach the recombiner, whilst the blue light gets there quicker again. So they reach the photographic plate with a delay between them, and this changes the fringe pattern. In fact, Sagnac, using the speed of the rotation of the table, calculated how much the fringes should change, and found that they did change by just that amount. The crucial feature of this experiment is that it demonstrates that the ether does exist, which demolishes relativity. How does the scientific establishment deal with this result? By muddying the waters with scientific gobbledygook. Wikipedia says, in the above discussion, the rotation mentioned is a rotation with respect to an inertial reference frame. Since this experiment does not involve a relativistic velocity, the same wording is valid both in the context of classical electrodynamics and special relativity. How on earth can it be valid in both theories? It clearly proves that the ether exists because the speed of the light is controlled by the ether, independent of the rotating table and mirrors. This experiment is never taught to university science students. They might begin to question what they were being taught about the cosmos, the universe, the Big Bang, evolution, and much else.
There is no such thing as absolute motion or absolute rest. Objects move relative to each other. For example, look at the truck with two kids playing catch. The truck is moving at a constant speed of 50 miles per hour, but as the kids are also moving with it at 50 miles per hour, they could easily think that they are standing still. When the children throw the ball at 10 miles per hour, they observe that the ball they have thrown is moving at 10 miles per hour. But their little brother, who is not on the truck and is standing still, has observed that the ball has moved at 60 miles per hour. He has added both the speed of the truck and the speed of the ball together. But is the little brother really standing still? No. The Earth is constantly in motion, the Sun is constantly in motion, and the galaxy is constantly in motion. Therefore, nothing is ever at absolute rest or absolute motion. Things just move relative to each other.
It is claimed, due to Earth's rotation, that water draining in sinks and toilets in the northern hemisphere spins clockwise, whilst upside down in the southern hemisphere it spins counterclockwise. There are also claims that snipers and ballistic calculations have to establish a control, when this is clearly not the case. Just as with Foucault's pendulum, while they blatantly claim it rotates with Earth's alleged spin, in reality spins in either direction without discrimination, neither do sinks nor toilets drain consistently as claimed by the so-called Coriolis effect, with many sinks having been found to drain both ways, simply depending on the shape of the basin and the angle of the water's entry, not from the alleged rotation of the Earth. Hurricanes and other cyclonic storms also do not follow the alleged Coriolis effect, with global wind patterns appearing to blow haphazardly around the ball. But when looking at the wind patterns on the azimuthal equidistant map projection, the weather patterns are found to consistently spin counterclockwise around the flat Earth, paralleling the rotation of the Sun, Moon, and planets against the stellar mobile above. The only ready explanation for this link between these two seemingly unrelated phenomena is in the ancient philosophical concept that the universe is manifest within an ocean of ether, and everything is interconnected.
They will also say that if a sniper is, is trying to hit something a great distance, a couple of miles away, they have to take into consideration the spinning of the Earth, because they say that as the bullet leaves the muzzle of the gun, it's now independent of the rotation of the Earth. So, the Earth will spin away from where the bullet, and you have to take that into account. They say that about artillery shells as well. But it's not true. If that was true, a sniper would have to spend ages and ages calculating how to make that shot, and they don't. They literally take into consideration the wind and the elevation, and they don't take the Coriolis effect into consideration at all. Also, planes. If that works for bullets, if bullets, as soon as they leave the Earth, they're now independent of the spin, then why doesn't it work for planes? There's a video on YouTube that actually tries to explain that the Coriolis effect works by using the example of a paper plane. You have to throw it. If you throw it north, the Earth will spin and the plane will land sort of east. But if you take the idea of a real plane, a plane would have to aim north to go east in that case, but that's not what happens. And if that was the case as well, planes would have to land on runways that are moving, and that would be impossible. But how is it that you can take a flight from London to New York and it will take exactly the same time as a flight from New York to London? One's with the spin of the planet and the other one's against it. So it doesn't make sense. They'll say that the whole atmosphere is moving, with the planet, but that doesn't make sense either, because the atmosphere, say it's that thick, the top layer of the atmosphere will be moving slow, and as further you get in, will be moving faster. So how, if everything is moving like that, how do you get a light breeze that blows against the spin of the planet? you know. How do you get a breeze that goes from north to south? It just doesn't make sense.